good morning, good afternoon, good night. It all depends where you're hearing us or seeing us in YouTube. Today we have the pleasure of talking with Professor Cees Hamelink. He is an academic. He studied law, communications in the University of Amsterdam, and has also written about several books about communications.
Right.
Lately, Siglo XXI just published this book named Ética del Ciberespacio, Cyberspace Ethics, which is really interesting. But first of all, I would like to go on the past.
Good.
When the internet just grew up, it made public, people used to talk not about ethics, about netiquette. Mm-hmm. What happened with the term netiquette? Where did it go? Did it disappear?
It just totally disappeared. But it just disappeared like in most societies, the notion of etiquette, which, for example, in my country, the Netherlands, was a very important concept that told you how to behave, how to eat with knife and fork, and how to greet people, and so on and so forth. That's gone. We no longer, behave according to etiquette. And that's the same, I think, in cyberspace, where there was sort of initially all kinds of rules, like you have to do this, you have to do that. But quickly, the technology overtook that. There's no use to tell people how to behave. People behave in their own way anyway, and to some extent the technology determines how people behave.
Now you talk about ethics, and in these books especially, you tell us that you are proposing that we could work with human rights as a strategy to get order in the cyberspace and maybe outside the cyberspace.
Yeah.
Why human rights?
Because it's the only moral catalog we have as human beings, the only set of rules that we have universally agreed to since 1948. There have always been sort of human rights in history, but human rights were usually exclusive. They were not for everyone. And what changed in an enormous revolutionary way in 1948, that we created this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And all the articles of the Universal Declaration begin with everyone. Everyone has the right. That is a real new thing. Of course, we don't live up to it. We still exclude people from those human rights, and human rights are being violated around the world 24 hours around the clock. But I think we need to realize we have something. Thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt, we got a document, that tells us how, in principle, we should relate to each other. Because the way we related to each other in the Second World War, under the Nazi regimes, in Europe and in Japan, is something that the world has agreed we never want to see that again. Now, that's a bit of a naive expectation. It's a romantic idea, but still, I'm a bit of a romantic person, and I believe in ideals, and I believe it's better to have some ideals, even if we don't live up to them, but to have something to aspire towards.
Many of the legal scholars nowadays, they think that talking about human rights is complex because somehow we need some kind of infrastructure that supports all the heavy weight of the human rights.
No, you're absolutely right. That is one of the weaknesses of the human rights regime. We don't really have enforcement mechanism. So if you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and you look out of the window, you think, well, the world actually should be a different place. The world should behave according to these principles, but the world doesn't do that. Now, human beings are not angels. That's why we need enforcement mechanisms. But I would like to see a world without police, for example. But I think that will be very hard. I don't necessarily believe that we will not steal and not murder and not do all these things and not make traffic violations without control. So we need, unfortunately, it's the weakness of the human being, we need forms of control. Now, what we have not managed in this world is to create very clear structures to enforce human rights. Like, for example, we don't have a world court on human rights. So where do you go if your rights are violated? We have weak mechanisms. We have commissions, we have committees. In Europe, we do slightly better with the European Court of Human Rights, but that's overworked and underpaid, all these judges, so that doesn't really function in an ideal way either. And that's, I think, is one of my pleas. If we take human rights seriously as sort of moral guidance, how we have to treat each other, then I think we also need enforcement mechanisms. And the ironic thing is that in this world, we have better enforcement mechanisms for trade rights than for human rights.
Yes.
We have the WTO as a mechanism that deals very well, with the liberalization of trade and with trade violations. That's all taken care of, but in the human rights field, we find that more difficult.
I must confess that when I read your book, I didn't read it in the order that you suggest. When I first read the introduction, then I changed to freedom of speech immediately. Because the cyberspace is a wild land. It's really wild. People have some sort of communication between them that can be kind of harsh. And this is how hard can it be to get all the people in the cyberspace get together, reduce his freedom of speech, and obey these principles that can be the human rights. Don't hurt anyone in the speech you do. Don't bully people in the cyberspace. How can we make this?
Well, but you're pointing to a very difficult issue, because there's tension in human rights. Like, for example, I have the right to freely express myself, but I also have to honor your right to your privacy. Now, should I write in my newspapers all kinds of stories about your private life? That would be a violation of your rights. But if you say you can't write these stories, you are violating my human right to freedom of expression. So it's a very complex issue. And that's why I plead for ethics in cyberspace, because in my notebook, ethics means talking about morality. It's not a set of the original, when I began thinking about this kind of book, I had the notion of decency in my mind, more than legal principles. Just we should treating each other in a decent way. And since we don't always know what that is, I don't believe that we have very simple recipes for how to behave. It's more complicated, like you indicated, with the freedom of speech. Do we have the freedom to preach hate of other people? Well, some people say yes, because I should be free to say I hate you. And others say no, because that is very damaging. So we have to work that out. And working that out, that's what ethics is all about. Sometimes people think ethics means clear moral rules, means etiquette, netiquette. No. I think what the interesting thing is about ethics, it's a continuous reflection, continuous conversation. So if we want to find a solution to this, then the two of us sit together and we talk about it. And we are open, we listen to each other. That's an important part of ethical conversation. And of course, few people listen to other people. Listening is a forbidding art. I mean, it's very, very difficult to really listen, because if you listen well, you may have to change. You may have to come to another conclusion. But that's what I'm pleading for. Let's create spaces. When the book was presented, here in the publishing house, I said, publishers of the world, unite, create open spaces for this reflection. We don't have to agree all the time. No, disagreement is good. Disagreement, for example, in academia helps us. It's tremendously good to have conflicts about this. But let's sit and let's try to work that out. Then we find solutions, and the solutions will not be forever. We don't any longer live in a world where we can have moral solutions that last forever. We have to reiterate, we have to all the time say, well, let's get back, let's talk about it. The world is changing, so we have to change, we have to find new forms of adapting to new worlds. And so that's basically what the book is all about. And then I say, if we're going to sit together, we need to have something to talk about. Now, cyberspace is one element, because increasingly much of our lives take place in cyberspace. Maybe we shop in cyberspace, we bank in cyberspace, some people even have sex in cyberspace. So it's going to be increasingly important to our lives. Now, so we know that reality. Now, how are we going to talk about this? Let's use the guidance of international human rights, because it's the only set of principles that the world, at least in theory, universally has accepted.
When I was reading your book, you talk about decency,
Yeah.
and I remain a book. I don't know if you read it. Avishai Magali, Decent Society.
Yeah, right, yeah.
When he talks about
Yes, I was very much inspired by that.
Yes.
That's where the notion comes from.
And I couldn't avoid to think about, to be decent, we need to be grown-ups. We need to be mature in order to accept what we don't like and hear it and listen it and don't be hurt by it.
Absolutely true, but that demands, the freedom of speech demands enormous maturity, because the freedom of speech is I am allowed to say things that you don't want to hear. Now, why would you accept me saying things that you don't want to hear? It demands an enormous maturity, certainly in power relations. Let's assume you're the president of Mexico, and I say things to you that you don't want to hear. That demands an enormous discipline, an enormous maturity of you, not to say, get rid of this guy. He says things I don't want to hear. And I think that moral maturity is in a way the crux, is in a way the essence of the freedom of speech and all this protection of privacy and all these other elements. And we need to begin with the kids. I have an enormous belief in the kids, even in the toddlers, when they're 2 years old, 3 years old. And certainly the kids when they are 4 years old, around the world. And I've worked with kids all over the world. And I'm impressed that in all societies, the 4 years old are great philosophers.
Yes.
They're not yet spoiled, by all this discriminative. They don't see differences between different complexions. Makes no difference to them whether you're black, green, violet, or whatever color you have. If you're a nice kid to play with, we'll play with you. Now that is very crucial, and I think morality and the notion and kids, as long as they're not spoiled by formal education, have a very distinct feeling for what's good and what's wrong, and for people who are good and people who are wrong. And I think that's where we need to begin, and we need to spend more attention on this ethical maturity, this ethical conversation, even before kids go to the basic schools. But I don't see that yet happening, but I think I'll be continuously pleading for that. I'm not a person who easily gives up.
Yes, and in the book there's a chapter where you talk about law, which is really interesting, because early in the century, people used to talk about we have to comply with the internet service provider in order that he can make the users obey the rules we put. But putting it in the speech, you talk about decency, that will be not a law, because it reduces or mature or reason.
Yeah, well, you see, I know that the law and the legal system is inevitable and will have to play a part in cyberspace, and will have to play a part in the enforcement of human rights. But the law is a very rough instrument. It's a very blunt instrument. It's not the best instrument to really solve problems of humanity or problems of human relations. We need to find a way to relate to each other in a decent way. And law can be helpful, but it's not the ultimate answer. The ultimate answer is us just reflecting on this and conversing on this and creating the space in which we listen to each other. The law is a system that orders people to do, you have to do this, you have to do this. And it often leaves very little space for reflection on that. Asking, the lawyers like to say, hey, this is the rule, just do it. And if you ask why, they say, well, it's just a rule. And for me, that's not enough. We always have to ask. What I taught my students over all these years that I've been teaching, the core message of my teaching is always ask, but why? But why? Give me a good argument. That's also what I tell little kids. If they get into discussion with their parents, ask the people that seem to command you. When your parents say, you just shut up, because the freedom of speech is often violated within families.
Yes.
And the kids now, fortunately, there's now a convention on the rights of children, and in Article 13 of that convention, the kids have the right of freedom of speech. So I tell these little kids, now when your parents say shut up, tell you that, see you in court, that Article 13.
Here in Mexico, we have several different, we are scarce in many things. We don't have, all the people don't have access to computers, they don't have access to internet, they don't have access to sometimes even food or water. Yeah. I understand in countries like Holland that people can have the human right of access to internet granted, but here in Mexico it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard thinking that all the people will have access to the internet, considering that they don't have even computers. Or if they have it, they don't have good computers to work with the internet. What we can do in third world countries, in peripheral countries, to get access to this internet. I remember that I once read Nicolas Negroponte, and he used to say that in third world countries it's easier to get the internet because they don't have the infrastructure that has to change. They just go with the first, the new things. But I don't think this is a problem of infrastructure. I think it's a problem of culture, it's a problem of politics. But I don't know, what do you think about this problem?
You know, if technically it's not so much of a problem to give everyone access to the infrastructure. That could be done. Of course, it's going to cost money. One should not be naive about it. Nicolas Negroponte, that you mentioned, designed this little $100 computer that can be easily used in developing countries. It's a computer that can even work without electricity. It works like an old-fashioned alarm clock that you just wind up. That's possible, you know, but when I said to him, all kids in the developing countries should have your computer, he said, yes. I said, but the computer costs $100. Do you know how many kids there are in the developing countries? He said, well, I have no idea. Well, I said, there's at least 2.5 billion kids in the developing countries. Now, who is going to pay the 2.5 billion times $100? He looked at me, he said, well, I haven't really thought about that. So, I mean, it's a matter of finance, but the finances are available. I once made a calculation for the International Telecommunication Union. If we want to provide everyone in the world with access to a telephone and all schools in the world with access to internet, how much would that cost? That would cost roughly $80 to $100 billion that would have to be invested. Now, that's a lot of money. But it is less than 1/10 of what the world spends on arms. So if we buy a couple of lethal weapons less, we can easily do that. And then everyone said, well, this is unrealistic. Then I said, I need another calculation. $80 billion in a year is an interesting figure because the world spends every year $40 billion on ice creams. So if we stop eating ice creams, we have already half the money. And the other $40 billion is spent on food for cats and dogs. Now, ideally, I love my cats, but I think it's an idea if we strangle all the cats and dogs. We have money enough to provide all of Africa with phones and with the internet access. But the problem here is it's a resolvable problem. We spent our money in a different way, and if we use the technology. But there are too many forces in this world that are not interested in having everyone access to internet. Because the internet, of course, is also a powerful weapon for people to talk to each other and to be informed about what happens in the world. And there are just too many member states of the United Nations where the governments are not interested in that. You see, the reality is, if you look at the almost 200 member states of the United Nations, most of these countries are authoritarian countries, are undemocratic countries. Now, unless that changes, I don't believe that the majority of rogue governments in the world are very willing to spend money on providing ordinary people with access to the internet. because the system is not based on ordinary people knowing what happens or talking back. The internet is a marvelous means. Finally, I remember many years ago, I was on a mission in Indonesia for the United Nations. The idea was that we would connect by telecommunication technology all the islands of the archipelago in Indonesia. And when I arrived, the Minister of Information said, "Why would you want to do that?" I said, "Well, to give people, the opportunity to talk back. People are voiceless, and the idea of the United Nations is to give a voice to the voiceless." He says, "We're not at all interested in giving all these people a voice. Why would we? Imagine that all these buggers are going to talk back to the political system." "No, that's only a problem, Mr. Hamelink. So you better go home. We're not interested." So I think if that's sort of the basic sentiment, then you can invite whatever technology you want, and it's not going to change. So before you talk about the technological possibilities, you have to talk about how democratic.
In the book, you talk about the trade in the world and in the cyberspace. A few weeks ago, I read a journalist article about the deep web and about the things you can get on the deep web. You can get access to pay someone to get killed, by instance. How can we control the trade in the internet? Because that's not only a problem of governments, it's a problem about people. People can get to hire people to do something awful and kill other people.
I don't think in the end we are able to control that. I think once we, as societies, decided to accept these digital technologies, we forgot to look at the dark side. I mean, technologies have an enormously bright side. It's nice to see all these networks growing and all these information channels and so on and so forth. But every technology always had its dark side. And I think the internet has a very dark side. And we could only, in a world in which we would all be morally mature, and in which we would all be democratic, the internet would be a marvelous instrument. But in the world as it is, it's also a very dangerous instrument. Not only for criminals, and for all the internet is a major money laundering machine, where taxes are easily escaped, where governments have no control over taxation in the internet. So that's the dark side of it. It's also, of course, a major instrument of surveillance. We live in glass houses. We've become totally transparent. It's ridiculous that we still talk about privacy. Privacy went out of the window when we decided to have digital technologies. We can complain about it, and we can try to install some rules and mechanisms, but it's a bit too late. We've given that away. So that's why I'm pleading for this ethical reflection in cyberspace, because I think the only thing that can still change that is when we come to a senses and we say, we need to have some agreement among each other as to how we're going to deal with it. Otherwise, we will never be able to deal with the dark side. I mean, look at, for example, the most popular mechanism on the internet is undoubtedly Facebook. And if you see how, without thinking, without reflection, hundreds of thousands of young kids give their private lives away, expose themselves. And I've always thought, when Facebook was invented, all the secret services in the world had a happy day. They opened bottles of champagne and they said, finally we know what all these people are doing. We always wanted to know what they were doing. And once they did it in secrecy, conspiring in secrecy, that must have been an enormous irritation for secret services. And now it's all out in the open. That's a real dark side.
Finally, two more questions to end the conversation. The first one, following...
The conversation should never be ended.
Well, now the interview will be over. Following your advice, why do people have to read your book? Why do you think your book is needed? I have my own reasons. Mm-hmm. I believe that the book is really interesting. It's good idea what you're talking. Although I see it hard to complain, I see it really hard. More in Mexico, I believe it's a really good book. But you, Professor Hamelink, what do you think? Why people should read your book?
Because I think people should engage in this ethical reflection, in this conversation, and they should use, I think, as guidance, as I've said before, the only universal set of moral rules that we have established and on which we have universal agreement, although we don't live up to it. That's the human rights regime. And I would like to see that the book helps students, particularly, to ask critical questions about the internet.